Elizabeth Taylor's accountant walked into her Bel Air bedroom in the spring of 1969 and told her she had a problem. The jewelry collection had grown beyond anything reasonable, beyond anything he could explain to the IRS, beyond anything a sane person could justify. He laid out the numbers on her dressing table, next to a Bulgari emerald necklace that had cost more than most people's houses. "You need to stop," he told her. What Taylor said in response, 4 words, spoken without looking up from her mirror, would turn out to be the most profitable financial decision in Hollywood history. And nobody would understand it until the night Christie's auctioneer's hammer fell for the very last time, and the number on the board read $116 million. If you have ever loved something so completely that other people thought you had lost your mind, then you already understand something essential about Elizabeth Taylor. And if you have ever been told that what you love has no real value, that it is indulgent, excessive, embarrassing, too much, then you understand even better. Subscribe now, because this is not a story about jewelry. This is a story about a woman who understood value in ways that institutions, experts, and the entire auction world would spend decades failing to grasp. To understand what happened in December of 2011, you have to go back much further than the Christie's conference rooms and the velvet display cases and the hushed conversations among specialists who believed they had seen everything. You have to go back to the beginning of Elizabeth Taylor's life in Hollywood, because the collection did not begin with Richard Burton, and it did not begin with romance, and it did not begin with the kind of reckless spending that gossip columnists spent 30 years describing. It began with something far more practical, and far more cold-eyed, than any of those explanations would suggest. Elizabeth Taylor arrived at MGM as a child, and what she found there was a system designed to extract maximum productivity from human beings while giving them minimum control over their own lives. The studio owned her image, her schedule, her public persona, and, through a series of contracts that her mother had signed on her behalf before Elizabeth was old enough to understand what she was agreeing to, a substantial portion of her financial future. She watched what happened to the women who came before her. She watched what happened to their savings, their autonomy, their ability to say no. She was 11 years old when she filmed National Velvet, and she was already paying attention in ways that would not become visible for another 4 decades. The first piece came in 1950, when Taylor was 18 and already one of the most recognizable faces in the world. It was a simple platinum and diamond bracelet, purchased not as a gift but with her own money, from her own first major paycheck. Her friends thought it was extravagant. Her mother thought it was sensible. Taylor herself said almost nothing about it, which would become her defining characteristic when it came to the collection. She did not explain herself, she did not justify herself, and she did not invite discussion. She simply continued, year after year, acquisition by careful acquisition, building something that no one around her fully understood. The studio system that had shaped Taylor's early life began to crack in the late 1950s, and for most actors this represented liberation. For Taylor, it represented something more specific, an opportunity. As the studios loosened their grip, the financial landscape of Hollywood shifted in ways that created enormous instability for the people who had built their lives inside those institutions. Contracts became shorter, guarantees became rarer. The safety nets that had once been woven into the fabric of studio employment, however exploitative, simply disappeared. Taylor watched this transformation with the same focused attention she had brought to everything since childhood, and she was reaching the same conclusion she always reached, which was that the safest thing a person could own was something the market had not yet figured out how to price correctly. And she responded to it in the only way that made sense to her, which was to continue doing what she had already been doing, converting her income into objects that could not be devalued by the collapse of any particular studio, or the cooling of any particular public enthusiasm, or the inevitable passage of time. By 1961, when production began on Cleopatra in Rome, Taylor had already assembled a collection that most people around her regarded as merely the extravagant hobby of a very wealthy woman. What they did not understand, what almost no one understood at the time, was the philosophy behind it. Taylor had observed, with the precision of someone who had spent her entire professional life inside a system built on illusion, that fame was the least reliable currency in the world. It could evaporate overnight, it could be destroyed by a single scandal, a single failed film, a single shift in public taste. But a Bulgari emerald did not care about your last box office performance. A cashmere sapphire was not affected by a bad review in Variety magazine. And so when the Bulgari boutique on the Via Condotti became something close to a second home during the long months of the Cleopatra production, Taylor was not shopping the way other people shop. She was investing the way other people invested in real estate or government bonds, with the same underlying logic and a considerably more sophisticated aesthetic sensibility. It was during this period that Richard Burton entered her life, and with him came the most famous chapter of the collection's history. Burton understood Taylor in ways that most people in her life did not, and one of the things he understood most clearly was that the jewelry was not a weakness. He shared her conviction, at least in this regard, and he added to the collection with a generosity and a scale that even Taylor occasionally found startling. The La Peregrina pearl, which had originally belonged to Mary Tudor, Queen of England in the 16th century, came to Taylor through Burton in 1969, purchased at auction for $37,000. The Krupp Diamond, a 33.19-carat Osher-cut stone that had once been part of the estate of a German industrial dynasty, arrived the same year. Burton paid $305,000 for it at auction, a world record at the time for any jewel. He gave it to Taylor for her birthday, wrapped in a handkerchief, with the casual confidence of a man who had no doubt that he was giving her exactly the right thing. What is less often discussed is what Taylor did with these pieces once they were in her possession. She did not simply wear them and enjoy them, though she did both. She studied them. She understood their provenance, their history, the specific qualities that made each piece significant beyond its material components. When jewelers and historians came to examine the collection over the years, and a remarkable number of them did, because the reputation of what Taylor had assembled spread quietly through professional circles long before the general public understood its scope, they consistently reported the same thing. Taylor's knowledge of what she owned was encyclopedic. She could discuss the cutting history of a particular diamond, the specific period of a Bulgari design, the significance of a stone's geographic origin, with a fluency that surprised people who had assumed they were dealing with a collector whose interest was primarily decorative. She was not a dilettante. She was a scholar of her own collection, and the distinction mattered enormously, because dilettantes buy for pleasure and scholars buy for understanding, and what Taylor had built over 5 decades was not a pleasure garden but a library, organized according to principles that only became visible when you stood back far enough to see the whole of it at once, and the collection itself was a document of mid-20th century craftsmanship and provenance that no institution had thought to preserve. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody anticipated, because what happened next is not what you would expect from a woman described for decades as impulsive, excessive, and financially reckless. The divorce from Burton in 1974, the first divorce, before the reconciliation and the second marriage and the second divorce, forced Taylor to make a series of financial decisions under conditions of considerable personal distress. The advisors around her expected her to liquidate. The collection, they argued, represented the most liquid portion of her assets, and selling even a fraction of it would have resolved the immediate financial pressures that the divorce had created. Taylor refused. She did not simply decline their advice, she dismissed it with the particular finality of someone who has heard an argument and found it not just wrong but irrelevant. The collection was not a resource to be drawn down. It was a position to be held. The logic was not sentimental, though sentiment surrounded it on every side. The logic was structural. Tangible assets held by a private individual are not subject to the same forces of devaluation that affect professional reputation, and Taylor understood this with a clarity that her financial advisors, ironically, did not. And in holding it, through 2 divorces and a series of film projects of varying commercial success and a period in the early 1980s when her public profile had dimmed considerably from its peak, she was executing a strategy that would have made sense to any serious long-term investor and that almost no one around her recognized as such. The 1980s brought Taylor a new chapter and a new cause. Her close friend Rock Hudson died of AIDS-related complications in 1985, and Taylor's response to that loss transformed the second half of her public life. She became the most prominent celebrity advocate for AIDS research funding at a moment when that advocacy carried genuine social risk, when the disease was still surrounded by silence and stigma and institutional indifference. She founded AMFAR in 1985 and spent the next 2 decades raising money with the same focused intensity she brought to everything else she cared about. What is less well understood is that the collection played a direct role in this work, not through sale, but through presence. Taylor wore pieces from the collection to fundraising events in ways that were carefully calculated to generate attention and conversation, understanding that her jewelry, in the right context, could amplify a message in ways that words alone could not. During these years, the collection continued to grow, though more selectively than in earlier decades. Taylor had developed what the few dealers who worked with her described as an almost perfect eye for quality, a calibrated sense of which pieces would hold their significance across time. She was buying less frequently, but what she bought was chosen with a precision that reflected 30 years of accumulated knowledge. The collection had ceased to be a hobby or even an investment strategy in the conventional sense. It had become something closer to a body of work, assembled with the deliberateness and the coherent vision that you would associate with an artist's output rather than a collector's accumulation. By the time Taylor died in March of 2011, at the age of 79, the public narrative of the collection had not substantially changed from the one established decades earlier. It was famous for its size and its romance and its association with Richard Burton. It was understood as the ultimate expression of a certain kind of Hollywood excess. What it was not understood as, what it would not be understood as until the Christie's auction in December of that year, was one of the most successful private investment vehicles of the 20th century. The Christie's specialists who examined the collection in the summer of 2011 were experienced, respected professionals who had handled the estates of monarchs and magnates and cultural figures of every description. They brought to the Taylor collection the same methodical rigor they brought to everything else. They catalogued each piece. They assessed condition, provenance, market comparables. They arrived at their estimate with confidence. Approximately $30 million, perhaps slightly more if bidding was competitive. It was, by any conventional measure, a generous valuation. What they had failed to account for, what no conventional measure could have accounted for, was the specific quality of what Taylor had assembled. What no one in that room could quite account for, as the evening began, was the quality of the audience. The bidders who had traveled to New York for this auction were not the usual roster of collectors drawn by market opportunity. Many of them had followed Elizabeth Taylor's life for decades, had watched her wear these pieces in photographs and on screen, had grown up understanding that these objects existed in a world adjacent to their own, present, visible, and permanently out of reach. Until now. The auction opened on December 13th, and what happened in the first hour made clear to everyone in the room that something unusual was occurring. The opening lots, which the specialists had priced conservatively, drew bids that moved past their high estimates before the rooms had fully settled. The Emerald Suite from the Cleopatra period attracted attention from buyers who had traveled specifically to bid on it, from 5 countries, competing in a way that bore no relationship to the sober financial calculations that normally govern transactions at this level. The La Peregrina Pearl, which Burton had purchased for $37,000 in 1969, sold for $11.8 million. The Krupp Diamond, for which Burton had paid $305,000, sold for $8.8 million. Piece by piece, lot by lot, the evening progressed through estimates and past them, and the running total on the board became a number that required a kind of recalibration of everything the people in that room thought they knew about the market for celebrity property. When the final hammer fell, the total was $116 million. It was the highest price ever achieved for a personal jewelry collection at auction. It was nearly 4 times the specialist's estimate, and it represented a return on investment that, calculated across the decades of acquisition and the prices Taylor had paid, was extraordinary by any standard of financial measurement. A woman who had been described as financially reckless for the entirety of her adult life had assembled, through what now appeared to be a coherent and sophisticated long-term strategy, one of the most valuable private collections in history. The industry response was immediate and somewhat disorienting. The rule that celebrity provenance adds sentiment but not value, the rule that every serious professional in the auction world had applied without examination for generations, had not simply been bent. It had been demolished by a woman who had apparently understood, half a century before anyone else did, that certain kinds of celebrity provenance were not sentiment at all but were themselves a form of quality, a verifiable historical significance that would only compound across time. Taylor had not been buying jewelry because she loved it, though she did love it. She had not been buying it because Burton gave it to her, though he did. She had been buying specific things, from specific makers, at specific historical moments, with a knowledge of what she was acquiring that the market had consistently underestimated because the market had consistently underestimated her. The accountant who had stood in her Bel Air bedroom in 1969 and told her she needed to stop was not a bad advisor. He was a competent professional working from the conventional assumptions of his field, and those assumptions told him that a woman accumulating jewelry at this rate and this scale was making an emotional decision that would require correction. What he could not have known, standing there next to the Bulgari emerald necklace on the dressing table, was that Taylor was not making an emotional decision at all. She was making a calculated one, and the calculation was going to take another 42 years to complete. The 4 words she spoke without looking up from her mirror, the response that her accountant would remember for the rest of his life, were not defiant. They were not dismissive. They were simply accurate, and in that accuracy lay the entire logic of everything she had been building since she was 18 years old and bought her first piece with her first real paycheck. She looked at her own reflection, with the calm of someone who has already done the math, and already seen the answer clearly, and she said, "I know what I'm doing." And she did.